Hey everyone, it's Joanne Molinaro, the Korean vegan. Today I decided to make a Persimmon Crescent roll coffee cake. Now, if you're new to my YouTube, you will find that instead of kind of rattling off the ingredients and going step by step through this recipe, what I like to do is actually put the recipe and steps in the subtitles below while we spend the time actually getting to know one another, talking about, current events or talking about ideas that I had over the week. So many of you know I am very open about my struggles with food and my relationship with food and disordered eating. I can't even call it a eating disorder. That's something I'm still working on with my therapist, but I have gotten around to at least admitting that I have a problem with disordered eating. I know, semantics, tomato, but it makes a difference to me. Now, for those of you who have eating disorders, or recovering from eating disorders, I do want to put a slight warning in here. I will be getting fairly specific about my struggles. So if that's something that's going to make it difficult for you, by all means, go ahead and mute my voice. I believe that my struggle with food definitely stems, at least in part, from my identity as a Korean American woman. As a Korean American, I am surrounded by women who, for the most part, are much smaller than me. In fact, when I was growing up, many of my girlfriends sort of freaked out if they weighed more than 100 pounds, when for me, I've weighed more than 100 pounds for as long as I can remember. To me, the woman who I looked up to the most was my mother. I wanted to be just like my mom in every single way, but most of all, I wanted to look like my mom. And no matter what I did, by the time I was 12 years old, I outgrew all of her clothes, all of her hand-me-downs, and I knew that I was never, ever going to look like my mom. My mom is incredibly strong, particularly when it comes to men. And I think the source of her greatest disappointment in me was the fact that I married the first man I ever loved. And ultimately, that relationship was incredibly toxic. I would end up fighting with my ex-husband, and it would get really bad, to put it mildly. And I would run to her house or drive to her house, and I'd knock on her door at 2 a.m. and I'd be sobbing and hysterical. And she would know immediately, oh, they got into another fight. And it got to the point where every time I showed up at her door, instead of saying the nice motherly things like, oh, come in, are you okay, honey? It was to, which means again in Korean. And I think her frustration was, why do you keep going back to this man who treats you so poorly? And of course, it was hard for her to see as a mother, but I think it was much harder for her to bear as a woman. Ultimately, one of the proudest moments of my life, and probably my, quote, crowning achievement, was actually leaving that marriage that was so bad for me. And I think in that way, I proved to myself that I could be as mentally tough as my mother was. But the other side of that was, the separation, sort of the anxiety and the stress that attends a divorce. Wow, that all added up, not just mentally, but physically. I ended up gaining about 40 pounds through that entire process. So a year after I finally separated from my husband, I decided it was time to take control over my body. And mind you, I have dieted basically my whole life. I know how to, I'm like a professional dieter, so I know how to diet. I just remember this time thinking, well, let's just try and take it slow and easy. Don't do a low carb or, low fat diet. Just try and eat relatively healthy and get a little bit of exercise, 3 or 4 times a week. And, I took before and after pictures, and I'd measure myself at 30 days, 60 days, and at 90 days. And wow, at 90 days, I really started to see a huge difference in my appearance. And you know what? It should have just stopped right there. Here's the thing. I'd get on the scale every single day, and I'd see another pound, another 2, or another 3 had melted off. And before I knew it, I was addicted to the feeling that I got every time I saw the number go down. And I didn't even realize it. And then it was just about chasing that high. I would actually end up weighing myself sometimes 17 times a day. And if I didn't see the scale move, that just meant I needed to eat less and exercise more. About 1.5 years of me, quote, dieting, I finally hit rock bottom, and I realized that, wow, you eating at 11 o'clock at night with all the lights off so that nobody actually sees you is pretty messed up. Probably time to do something about it. And I decided to see a therapist to, I guess, work through my disordered eating. Now, in that time, I've discovered a lot about myself. I wish that this video could be a cure-all solution for people with disordered eating or eating disorders, but it isn't. Because one thing that I've discovered is that I may end up having to spend the rest of my life fighting the urge to chase that high on the scale again. Addictions don't just disappear because you don't feed them. One thing that has revealed itself to me through this whole journey is that however much I love the way my mother looks, the reason she scares the fuck out of me is because of what she chose. When she was a toddler, my grandparents whisked her out of their home in North Korea and literally carried her to what is now South Korea. She spent most of her childhood living off the charity of the village they settled in, digging through the dirt on her hands and knees for leftover crops and sweet potatoes. She excelled at school, even when her parents never had enough money for books, uniforms, or even shoes. After my grandmother buried her babies in multiple attempts to have a son, my mother assumed that role for herself. She learned how to take care of the family farm under my grandfather's careful tutelage. She immigrated to the United States with no job, barely any money, and unable to speak English, with the hope of improving not just her own fortune, but that of all those back home in Korea. She worked her ass off as a nurse and climbed the ranks to ultimately become the director of the emergency department at a hospital in Chicago. She raised 2 kids who've never smoked or done any drugs ever, and who both spoke perfect American English. And even with all of this, she finds time to write and publish her poetry, practice her calligraphy, and sing in the church choir. I catalog the choices I've made over the past decade to bring me where I am. The time I slept in my office floor, in my suit, because I knew I would have to get back to work in just a few hours. The time I ran 3/4 of a mile along the lakefront path after not working out for over 3 years. The time I picked up a camera and snapped a photo of my mom's hands hugging a cup of tea. The time I wrote a poem about my mom, about her hands, a cup of tea, Lake Michigan, and the quiet sorrow I inherited from her. The time I wrote a blog about how I love Korean food and why I won't let going vegan stop me from eating kimchi. Most of all, I think of that time I drove a car packed with 16 years of my life in the trunk towards the city, telling my mom for the very last time, this time, I'm not going back. I realize now that I've been thinking of it all wrong. It's not about shrinking into my mother's skin. All this time, I've been trying to grow into it. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for joining me again, for listening to our chat. If you enjoyed this recipe and our discussion today, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so that you don't miss a future recipe and chat. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful, safe, and lovely day.